Hello everyone, welcome to lecture. In this part we're going to be talking about nutrition for fitness, and in this lecture we will kind of continue our study of applied nutrition and how you can take what you've learned about the nutrients and some of the different things about the body and kind of combine those and look at how you can eat or plan a diet based on some desirable effect or condition that you're hoping to elicit. And in this case, we'll look a little bit about some of the dietary plans and strategies for exercise. And just to give you a little bit of background on the way that this lecture will be formatted, in previous semesters I've set this up as nutrition for sport. And sports nutrition is a topic that, is growing in popularity, and there are programs of study and at universities all across the nation where people offer degrees in sports nutrition. And I kind of originally tailored the lecture to be about sports nutrition, but that got a little bit into more, competitive eating for, events. And that is definitely a different ball game. Preseason, postseason type of eating plans versus different types of menu planning strategies for different types of sport, whether they're, high intensity or low intensity sports. And then I switched gears because I got, a lot of feedback from students about liking more information about general exercise. So I'm not, a competitive athlete, and I'm not running in triathlons quarterly, but I would like to know, if I should have a banana before I go to the gym. So then I kind of switched it up to nutrition for exercise, where I would talk a little bit about, the role of Gatorade and when you're running for an hour. But then I would get emails from the athletes that would say, yeah, I would love to know a little bit more about carbohydrate loading. So it was kind of tough to find that fine point in the middle. And I think the way I've divided the topic this time will kind of cover both bases, in that there are basically, even though there are different motives and different goals for performing these activities, whether you're, exercising just for your general health and well-being, or you're exercising because you're motivated to win something, I think that there are two basic types of exercise that people design these different strategies after, are whether you're exercising for aerobic type events where you're, practicing working on your cardiovascular system, versus resistance type exercises where you're working on strength and power. So I've split them into those two segments. So we'll talk a little bit about the nutrients that are most important to consider for aerobic or longer term activities that are done at a little bit of a lower intensity, versus nutritional planning or nutrients to consider for resistance or things that are done for a shorter duration at a much, much higher intensity, focusing on muscle work. And really, guys, if you look at, even the two, again, going back to what the motive is, whether you're exercising for health or sport, which was kind of hard to design a lecture after each of those into one, really the exercises and the activities are the same. So just to give you some examples, an individual that's working out with a trainer who really wants to, drop a few pounds and reduce his blood pressure, what will this individual do? He'll probably get on a treadmill or, outside, whatever the setting is, he'll probably jog. And he may do so at a moderate intensity. And we'll talk a little bit about, what defines exercise intensity. But for now, we'll say he'll do it at a moderate intensity, maybe for 20 to 30 minutes. And he might do that, 3 to 5 days per week. And that would be helping him to meet his goal. An athlete, maybe even an elite or professional athlete working with a strength and conditioning coach, wants to increase his pitching speed. And so he's on an exercise regimen, among other things. But what's he going to do with his strength and conditioning coach? He's probably going to get on a treadmill and he's going to jog. He might do so at a higher intensity. So instead of being at a moderate, 40% or 50% of his max, he might be working at a 70% of his max because he's trained and acclimated to do so. But the activity is the same. And so really when you're splitting hairs about eating for different activities, there really isn't any reason to break up exercising for health or exercising for sport, because the activities that these people are participating in are exactly the same. Whether you're at a gym and lifting a barbell or you're lifting a giant tire because you're a professional football player, they're the same activities eliciting the same kind of muscular and physiological responses. So a little bit of a long intro on the strategy here, but just in case you're wondering throughout, gosh, I wish this talked more about sport, or wish this talked more about just regularly going to the gym, kind of keep in mind that the activities that you'll partake in are going to be very similar for both of those. And the first type of, I want to elaborate a little bit more on physical activity for health and leisure, because there are already well-defined recommendations and standards for this type of physical activity. And so we'll talk a little bit about those too. I think it would be silly to go through this lecture without mentioning the recommendations for physical activity. And kind of, again, one of the big objectives of this course is to open your eyes to some of the problems with people's health and, you know, how you can be healthier. And so talking about those recommendations is kind of key for doing that. And talking about the statistics, how sad it is that only 60% of children meet physical activity recommendations, and only 20% of adults meet physical activity recommendations. And this is a huge change from, you know, not a long time ago at all, where the majority of the population did get that physical activity in, whether it was just their way to, you know, commute to work or things they would do around the home. And we were just, you know, a little bit more industrious in the way that we were active. So now 80% of adults do not meet the recommendations for physical activity. And this is definitely one of the reasons, and we talked last lecture about nutrition for health, one of the reasons that we're seeing a spike in the incidences and prevalences of non-communicable diseases. We all know that exercising to, you know, help your blood pressure, help raise that HDL cholesterol, have denser and stronger bones, have less pain from daily activities like gardening and walking and taking out the trash. We know that doing physical activity regularly leads to decreased incidences of these things and overall a decreased death rate from all causes of mortality. So it's really important, as you know, I know you guys aren't nutrition majors necessarily, but it's important to, you know, share with friends and family while you're learning about nutrition the importance of physical activity in that mix too. Because if you participate in physical activity and exercise, you'll increase your cardiovascular endurance, you'll increase your muscular strength, you'll be more flexible, which, you know, probably isn't a concern to you now, but as you grow older, flexibility is a big deal. It's a lot bigger deal than bicep diameter and waist circumference. Like, I know that's probably more of a concern for yours now in your fitness regimen, but as you get older, flexibility becomes a big deal because it helps with mobility and less pain. And then also doing exercise, there's a big new trend for exercises that simultaneously condition both cardiovascular, muscular, and flexibility. And if I were to give you a good example of one program that kind of does all of these simultaneously, CrossFit would be a good example. It's definitely more on the strength training side of the fence, but they certainly do push the endurance umbrella too. So the goal of that is to strengthen cardiovascular and strengthen muscular systems at the same time. So we do know that relationship. It's well studied. And again, we'll get to those recommendations for exercise in just a couple minutes. But now I want to talk a second about sports. So again, I'm just kind of giving you the two big topics here, and then we'll break away from that permanently. But athletes, they exercise for a different reason. They're not necessarily trying to, you know, improve their health or maintain their health status. They're doing so that they're more competitive and more likely to win at the sport that they participate in. And this is definitely a growing and popular topic. We do know that diet and physical activity are strongly linked to, you know, how fast someone can pitch, or what's someone's driving speed, or even how well they swing a golf club. I mean, it's funny to see at golf clubs how they have dietitians and trainers running around that get people's bodies in better condition. It seems like a somewhat, I won't say sedentary, because you do expend a lot of calories in golfing, but you know what I mean. It doesn't seem like a sport that require such a rigorous physical activity and nutrition regimen, but it is true. So even though the motives are different, take-home message, for participating in physical activity for health versus participating in physical activity for competitive reasons, the actual activities that you're doing for either one of these are very similar. And they're always going to increase your endurance, your power, or some way both. And then before we also move on in our talk looking at nutrients for aerobic activities versus nutrients for resistance activities, I do want to say most of the research do show that the RDA, which we've talked about before, the general daily allowances that are recommended They do not change for athletes. They do not change for weekend warriors. They do not change for regular exercisers. So if you're meeting the recommendations for each of those 6 classes of nutrients that we talked about, you know, carbs, fat, protein, vitamins, minerals, and water, as long as you're meeting those general recommendations and meeting those regular, plain old daily values that we talked about, and this is just like the health lecture too, if you're following those recommendations and you're doing your best to have, you know, a preventative type of diet, if you're eating a good, well-balanced diet, following the food guide pyramid, there aren't any extra special needs above and beyond for people who are exercising. But since there are problems with performance, if you have too little or too much of particular nutrients, there has been a big market for developing diet plans for exercising. And so 2 big strategies, again, are going to be our aerobic. We're going to take a look at aerobic events and resistance events and talk about some of the dietary strategies for each of those. So looking at our regular systems model that we always have, just to kind of give you a good, big, comprehensive picture of how this stuff all fits together. I'll go over all of it first and then the little parts. So again, we're talking about aerobic exercise. And again, the goal here might be to, let's look over here at the big goal. It might be to enhance endurance. So we're going to do aerobic exercise to enhance endurance. And it might be for health reasons, and it might be for competitive reasons. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the recommendations here for health-related exercise. So the government, or the Center for Disease Control, has done a ton of research and said that to prevent the onset of chronic diseases and early mortality, people should exercise at this amount. They recommend using large muscle groups for these activities, and I think that kind of, you know, what defines aerobic activity is that you're using big groups of muscles, and you're using those big groups of muscles for a long time. So you're really working out that muscle, and you're really getting oxygen to it, and you're partaking in that for quite some time. And so you're using large muscle groups. Typically, these exercises end in ing or ing, so it's running, climbing, swimming, cycling, etc. The intensity in which you participate in these activities should be moderate. And just to give you a few different ways that moderate intensity exercise is defined, you can be very labby and clinical about it, and it can be defined by a person's VO2 max. You may have heard this term before, and I know this is a GE class, so I'll keep this simple, but VO2 max is basically just a measure of how much oxygen you're consuming. The V stands for volume, so it's the amount of oxygen you're consuming, and we can actually get a good indication of what intensity someone's working at by how much oxygen they're consuming. If you think about it, right now you're breathing at a certain resting rate where you could measure it in milliliters per minute, and you're breathing a certain amount. As you begin physical activity and your muscles begin working and you begin requiring more oxygen for metabolic processes, you start breathing faster. You start taking in more oxygen. So by putting a little mask over your face and catching that oxygen that you're inhaling and expiring, you're actually able to kind of predict the intensity, or actually not predict, you're able to state the intensity that you're working out. So VO2 max is a very clinical way to speak to exercise intensity, and it's not a measure that you'll see on common gym equipment, like this kind, shown in this figure right here. What you will see on common gym equipment are the following 2. We also speak to exercise intensity as an expression called MET, or metabolic equivalence. If you've ever worked out at the gym, a lot of the machines, the aerobic machines anyway, do have this unit. And metabolic equivalents, to keep it simple, are basically an exponent of the amount of energy that you're using at rest. So a MET, or a MET of 1, is like completely sitting down. And then multiples of that indicate exercise intensity. So if you're exercising at a MET of 2, it's 2 times the amount of energy you would expend at rest. If you're exercising at a MET of 3, it's 3 times the amount of energy that you would expend at rest. So it's a very simple type of unit, and the moderate intensity that's recommended by the Center for Disease Control is to exercise at a metabolic equivalent, or at intensity above rest, at about 3 to 6 times. So they're saying if you're 3 to 6 times above your resting MET rate, then you are participating in moderate activity. I think the third one and the last one that we'll talk about is the most common way to express exercise intensity, and this is done by target heart rate. And this is the one, again, you'll see expressions of this on gym equipment, and it's probably the unit we're most familiar with. But just kind of a recap, the CDC says that you want to exercise at a moderate intensity. That's about 55 to 70% of your heart rate max. And the particular way that you calculate target heart rate, I'm going to get a little blank page here. Let's see, new page. So the way that you calculate heart rate max is to take your age. Actually, I'm going to, let's see, undo that. I'm going to actually try to write it in black pen instead of this highlighter font feature. Sorry, guys. Give me that. No, I want black. Okay. So the way that you calculate your target heart rate is to take 220 minus age, and there's little calculators you can use to do this online, but the math is really easy. We'll just keep it simple. Most of you are probably in the age range of 20 to 30, so we'll keep the math simple and say 20. So you take the number 220, that's your static value. You minus from it 20, that equals obviously 200. Now, the government says that you want to work within a heart range percentage of 55 to 70% of this max. So 200 being the max, and you want to work at 55 to 70% of that. So let's say we're shooting for an exercise intensity of 60% of our heart rate max. This is our target heart rate. So what is 60% of 200? 120, I think. I did that right. So you would be looking at 120 beats per minute, okay? So when you're sitting there on the treadmill or on the elliptical or on the stair climber or doing something on like cycling, whatever it is, you want to make sure that your heart is beating about 120 beats per minute. This is your indication that you're exercising at a moderate intensity. And the way that you can do this very quickly and easily is to take your two fingers and place on your artery. And the best recommended method is to count to 10 and then multiply that by 6. But I actually don't like to multiply by 6 because I'm not a math person. So for me, it's easier to just count to 6, and it's probably a little less accurate, but it still gives you a good idea, especially if you do it a few times throughout your exercise. But count to 6 and then multiply it by 10. And the reason we do that, again, is to get to that 60-second mark. So if I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 beats per 6 seconds, I multiply that by 10 to come up with 90, and I know I'm beating at 90 beats per minute. Well, that's a little bit below where I want to be at 120, so I hit the up arrow a couple times to increase that intensity. So again, the recap here is that when we're doing aerobic exercise for health-related reasons, we can simply follow the CDC's recommendation, which is that you should exercise at a moderate intensity. And that moderate intensity can either be gauged by VO2 max, which is a very labby measure. It can be expressed as metabolic equivalence on a unit that you're working on, or it can be done by calculating your heart rate max. You can also find machines that do this for you if you grab the sensors, but I personally think it's best to just calculate your own because, again, think about what is an independent thing there is your age. Some machines you can put your age in, but if you can't, then it's just basically this guess, and those machine little sensors aren't always very accurate. So the CDC also says that you should exercise for aerobic reasons about 30 to 45 minutes per day. And not every day. The frequency actually, depending on the source that you look, you'll see different frequencies. So I think the old school one, and I haven't been able to find a lot of consistency. A lot of the newer recommendations that you'll find, and even government health type entities will say every day. So they're hoping to get people to not worry so much about that whole moderate intensity thing, just be physically active every day. But the original CDC recommendations that are still definitely out there as the primary recommendation is that moderate intensity 3 to 5 days per week. So 3 to 5 days per week is kind of your target. But again, most experts these days are saying, hey, ditch the whole moderate intensity thing. Do it for as long as you can every single day of the week. That's definitely a better key for health types of exercises. and the duration being 30 to 45 minutes. Now again, depending on what your goals are, if you're just trying to maintain the health of your blood vessels in your heart, then 30 minutes is probably fine. And 30 minutes, 5 days a week, you're certainly taking the right steps for preventative health. But if you wanted to cut weight, lose some weight, you might want to go ahead and do it at a little longer duration so that you're expending more calories. So maybe bump the intensity down to the lowest end of that range, maybe 50% of your heart rate max or 3 MET, and then do it for 45 minutes to 60 minutes instead. So again, and that's actually a really good transition to, you really can customize, and this is why it's smart to sometimes work with a trainer. You can customize based on what you want your end goal or end result to be. You just customize the intensity, the duration, and the frequency in which you work out to meet those goals. And that's exactly what a trainer will do for you. And if you're an athlete, and depending on what sport you're exercising for, you do the same thing. You're still doing aerobic activities. You're still either jump roping, running, stair climbing, same activities. You just doctor or prescribe the intensity, frequency, and duration to meet some sport-specific goal. So let's talk a little bit about the nutrients of consideration here. So these are the nutrients that are important for aerobic type exercises, and we'll talk about each of these independently, and along the way we'll look at some different figures and we'll talk about some of the different key transformation things that are important for understanding why these are important nutrients to consider. And then we'll talk lastly to wrap this up about some of the adaptations that will take place if you exercise, manipulate, or modify these nutrients, and how that transformation will lead to enhanced endurance and these feedback adaptations that we'll talk about. So the first one, of course, goes without saying, is carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are certainly the most important nutrient to consider for aerobic type exercise. Now we're going to move over to the next slide because I want to talk with you a little bit about the importance of carbohydrate utilization depends on how long you're exercising. And so let's start broadly by saying we're going to be exercising a while. We already talked about that. One of the things that make aerobic exercise what it is that you're doing it kind of for a long time. And so we can see by this figure right here, carbohydrates are so important because we need them at the very onset of exercise, because in this first minute of exercise, we're using anaerobic glycolytic systems. And you might not remember, but during the nutrient processing lecture, we talked about whether metabolism was aerobic or anaerobic. Well, this glycolytic means that we're burning carbohydrates, and we're burning those carbohydrates without oxygen. And that leads, remember, to the buildup of lactate. And this will become important as we talk later, because it'll be the rationale for why some people try to take buffers when they exercise so they don't feel that acidic burn. So that first few seconds of exercise, we're using carbohydrates, and we're using them in an anaerobic fashion. And then as the exercise stretches out to, we're only talking seconds here, but as we get a couple minutes past that first few seconds, we start burning energy, carbohydrates specifically, in an aerobic fashion. And again, this is of course with oxygen available. So point is here is we talked also in that nutrient processing lecture, and this is why it was important to get all that stuff out of the way before we started talking about diet plans and exercise prescriptions for particular reasons, because it's kind of important to understand catabolism. We talked about how you can either be building anabolism or breaking down catabolism. And we literally take nutrients, and we're talking carbs, so I'll keep it specific. We take these nutrients and we break them down to regenerate ATP in the muscle. So when our muscles contract, the only way that our muscles contract, so definitely applicable to exercise here, is we break off that phosphate bond from that ATP. Now we take these nutrients, say glucose, which is again carbohydrates specifically, we have to reform this ATP. We have to put that P back on because we just broke it off. So we put that P back on by breaking down that carbohydrate. This process, again, is called catabolism. So we want to resynthesize that ATP, and we do so using catabolized nutrients. And for aerobic exercise, carbohydrates are the most important because we need them here at the onset, and we need them throughout the entire duration of the activity. Go back to this slide right here and talk a little bit more specifically about fuel utilization and exercise intensity. So right there we just talked about time. Why are carbohydrates so important? Because they're important at the onset, right when exercise starts, and they're important as the duration of the exercise continues. So carbohydrates are important right away and as we go through the aerobic exercise activity. Looking at the next slide, we also see why carbohydrates are so important because we use carbohydrates in a proportional relationship with exercise intensity. So remember we just talked about moderate intensity. It's like over in, this little category. Oh, actually you can see that green little thing right here. As we exercise at that moderate intensity, like that recommendation says, which is honestly what most of us are going to do. We're going to be in that moderate range. Low intensity is for people with, disabilities, people that are severely overweight, and high intensity is for when you're training for something competitive. The majority of us exercise at a moderate intensity. So at a moderate intensity, you can see how great our reliance on carbohydrate is. So the take-home message here, and you can also see that here on this part, is that as exercise intensity increases, this is carbohydrate. Let's not worry about whether it's muscle or blood at this time. Carbohydrate, and as we go from walking to jogging to running, we use exponentially more and more carbohydrates. So recap, carbohydrates are important, one, because they're important based on the timing of exercise at the beginning and as we continue. And they're important too because as we move from rest through low intensity to moderate intensity exercise, we become more and more reliant on carbohydrates as our primary fuel source. And you can see that best illustrated here with walking, jogging, and running. As we increase that intensity from rest all the way to low intensity to moderate to high intensity, we rely more and more on carbohydrates. And we'll come back to this figure in just a couple minutes when we talk about fat. So let's talk specifically about the carbohydrate prescription. So we're going to break this up based on, and here's again where, it kind of gets complicated because not only are we looking at some of the energy systems or catabolic systems to regenerate ATP in our muscle, but we also have to consider carbohydrate dosage based on the time. So now we're like, oh gosh, so how much carbohydrate do I eat every day versus how much carbohydrate do I eat 2 hours before exercise versus 1 hour before exercise versus during exercise, and you can see what a complicated diet plan that is. So I'm going to try to keep it as simple as possible and say, looking at the intake plan for carbohydrates, you follow the same recommendation as the AMDR. So the exact same one. You guys remember what that was? Anywhere from, 55 to 60, and it even goes for really people that are exercising every day. I've even seen that bumped all the way up to 70% of calories. So you follow that kind of same prescription for making sure that 50 to 70%, and you see that range opened up a little bit. I think we stopped at 60%, which is the AMDR cutoff, but it does bump up a little bit if you're exercising regularly. So anywhere from 55 to 70% of your calories will be from carbohydrates. And that's just a general everyday eating strategy. And this level will suffice for any kind of regular exercise for both athletes and for people who are just exercising for their health purposes. Now, days prior to an event, so say we're talking now about something lasting more than 90 minutes. So now we're talking about you're going rowing all day, or you are running in a marathon, or you are, in a CrossFit competition over the weekend. So when it comes to carbohydrate intake days prior, and again, this is only for events lasting more than 90 minutes, you might want to consider some kind of carbohydrate loading regimen. And I'm not going to go into all the different protocols for that. One, it gets very complicated. And two, there are all kinds of different theories and postulations about the best way to carbohydrate load. But in a nutshell, guys, it's a series of depleting your carbohydrate stores and repleting them days leading up to an event. So the old classic paradigm for carbohydrate loading was to completely empty out your liver and your muscle, and there's two big tanks. Your liver and your muscle hold all that stored carbohydrate, which if you remember was called glycogen. So you've got these two big storage tanks, and the old classical theory was to completely deplete that tank days prior and then load it up, eat as many carbohydrates as you can, and by depleting it and reloading it, you'll actually have a capacity to store more. And then they switched to protocols where the depletion phase wasn't just from dietary restriction, it was also from exercise. So now we're depleting it by not eating any carbs and exercising, and then really taking in and loading the carbs and not doing any exercise. So point is that it's definitely changed over the years, the exact programming for carb loading, but the basic concept is the same, and it's a principle that people still do try, especially before events lasting more than 90 minutes. They'll deplete those 2 tanks of all of the glycogen, and then days prior to the event, they'll reload, and so they'll eat as many carbohydrates as they can, up to 90% of their calories as carbs, to fill that glycogen tank, both the liver and the muscle, as much as possible, so that they have the most glycogen available during the time of their event. So the only thing to consider days prior is possibly a carbohydrate loading regimen, and I recommend if you want to look at a specific protocol, then you research that, because there are different ones, and again, they involve depleting by exercise and diet restriction, and then repleting by restricting exercise and overloading on carbohydrate intake. So to go into the exact percentages and amounts in grams would probably be a little bit beyond the scope of our learning. So what about for 2 hours prior to exercise? So generally, and again, guys, you won't find a whole lot of consistency because people are always on the internet. They're trying to sell you, carbohydrate-rich products, or they're written by people who are, it's anecdotal. They're exercisers, and they'll tell you what works for them, but everyone's metabolism is so different. But I think the general consensus from most of the experts that I've talked to, I think 2 hours prior, the general recommendation is about 50 grams. So 50 grams of carbohydrate, how much is that? It's about 1.5 cups of cereal or 1.5 cups of pasta, maybe 2, maybe 3, depending on how dense it is, but 2 to 3 slices of bread. You could even resort to some kind of a high starchy energy bar, like Power Bars are really popular for this. You're supposed to eat those a couple hours prior. I think Power Bar is a good one specifically because they've doctored the carbohydrate content to have about 15 grams per ounce. And again, if you look at how much a Power Bar weighs, it's about 3.5 ounces. And so again, if you multiply that 15 by 3.5 ounces, that's about that 50 grams. So things like that are good to eat about 2 hours prior. So either 1.5 cups of cereal, rice, pasta, a couple pieces of bread, or something like a Power Bar will be a nice food to have about 2 hours before you start your exercise. Now, what type of food? This is also an important concept. You want to make sure that the food that you're choosing is high in starch, okay, that it has more glucose than fructose. And the reason why is because glucose definitely is more friendly to the formation of glycogen than is fructose. And so if you remember anything from when we talked about carbohydrates, then you remember that fructose is really high in fruit. So, kind of against what a lot of people would think, fruit that's high in fructose isn't probably the best choice. Now, you could ask, well, what about a banana? Well, banana happens to be really high in starch, and it's not that sweet. It's not that high in fructose. So banana would be a good choice because it's high in starch, and it has more glucose than fructose. Fructose is the sweeter of the two of those simple sugars. So banana might be a good choice, and you can simply look this stuff up. Again, we're not going to talk about a million specific foods because we'd never get through all of the, basic concepts. But if you want to look up, you could Google what is a carbohydrate-rich food that has, that's high in starch and that is low in fat. And, those foods would probably come up, and probably on some kind of sports nutrition site. They've been working on these things for years. So you want to make sure that the carbohydrate snack that you have about 2 hours prior is about 50 grams of carb, that it's high in starch, and that it has more glucose than fructose. So in other words, you're probably not going to want an orange because that's going to be a lot of fructose, not a lot of starch, and that's going to cause a big spike in blood sugar. And we'll get to that in just a second. And again, some of those foods that you could have are cereals, pastas, or rices, or something that's been, made for sport, like a Power Bar or a Cliff Bar. What about 1 hour prior to exercise? So with 1 hour prior to exercise or immediately prior, so anywhere from 1 hour out up until the time that you're, parking at the gym, you want to have about 25 grams of carbs. And this is actually something that I have seen a lot of conflicting. I've seen 25, I've seen 35. That's kind of a big difference considering that 2 hours prior you're eating 50. So I started researching the Gatorade series. They have the Prime, which is like the preparatory carbohydrate amount, versus the performance, which is during, and then the recovery. So I started looking at the carbohydrate differences between those 3 different versions, which is kind of like what we're talking about. And the prime, which is the one that you have immediately before you start the activity, has 25 grams of carbohydrate. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to stick with the 25. So 1 hour to immediately before exercise, you're looking at about 25 grams of fiber. And you want this one to be low glycemic and low in fiber. And that sounds kind of contradictory because fiber does blunt glycemic responses, but fiber also slows the food getting through your system. And since you're eating it, you know, pretty much immediately before you're working out, you don't want it to be too slow to get into your bloodstream, or else those carbohydrates won't be available to you metabolically during your workout. So this little slide shows glycemic index over time and why it's important to choose a food that has a lower glycemic index, or that's not super, super rich in simple sugar. And the reason why is because you can see that how blood sugar goes up, but then it drops. This is a phenomenon called rebound hypoglycemia, where it goes up, but then what happens right here, insulin is released from the pancreas, the insulin's now in the blood, and now all the sugar is being taken into cells, and so now your blood sugar levels drop. And so you don't want a food that's super, super high in sugar and has a really, really high glycemic index, because at 50 minutes of exercise, you're going to have low blood sugar. Where if you have a food that has a lower glycemic index, you're going to have a steady release into the intestine and a steady uptake into cells. So it's really important to kind of focus on type of food, especially 1 hour up to immediately prior to exercise. Focus on low glycemic, low sugar, and somewhat low in fiber, or else the food's not going to get into the bloodstream to begin with. Now, what foods are good for this? One of my favorite foods for exercise is kind of like a granola raisin mix, and I'm not huge on, you know, doing all these fun creative things for exercise. I personally am a believer, just like with health and fitness, if you have a well-balanced diet, you don't have to pay that close of attention, especially if you're healthy. You know, there are some days during an exercise regime that I'm a little bit tired, or regimens that I'm more tired, and I'm sure it's attributed to lack of nutrients in my blood, but hey, it's one day of a lot that I'm choosing to exercise, so I'm not super careful. But when I am trying to prepare for something big, like if I'm going to be out boating and rowing or kayaking all day, I might pay attention. I like making a mix of granola that's about maybe 30% oats and then about 70% nuts and raisins. Now, the fat is there, so it's kind of contradictory because I'm saying don't have foods that are really high in fat. Fat does definitely delay stomach emptying, and so it will slow down the rate that the food empties from your stomach into your intestine. But if you just have a few nuts peppered in, they provide that little bump in calories. The raisins are a food that is relatively low glycemic index, relatively low in fiber, and then you've got that high starch of the oats and a little bit of fiber from that too, but it's just this nice little energy mix. And I guess that's the same kind of basic principle that most of those energy bars are done off of. They're either rice or oats of some kind. They have some kind of little dried fruit in them, maybe a little syrup that keeps it all bound together, but same kind of concept, and it really does balance out. So 1 hour to immediately prior, to recap, 25 grams-ish, low glycemic, low fiber. You want to make sure that you're not getting this drop in blood sugar at about 50 minutes into your workout. Now, what about during exercise? So during exercise, the whole concept here is that your metabolic systems are bumping, you're burning liver glycogen, and liver glycogen is actually being shot out into the blood so that you have your blood sugar levels are maintained. You also are using muscle glycogen right there on the spot. You're burning a mixed combination of fats, and we haven't talked about fats yet, but you're burning carbohydrates and fat. It's definitely a mixed fuel source, but you don't want to run out of glycogen. So when you start to run out of glycogen is when you start feeling fatigued, you start burning carbohydrates anaerobically, you get that buildup of lactic acid, so you don't want this to happen. So the principle or the theory behind having some carbohydrates during your exercise program is a concept called glycogen sparing. So you want to spare that glycogen, use it in the muscle, localized, instead of sending it out to the bloodstream to maintain blood sugar. If you can maintain blood sugar while you're working out by like some kind of drink or goo or something real light and almost like a liquidy type, semi-viscous, you don't want your, the contents of your stomach to be heavy, but if you can maintain blood sugar by taking it in instead of breaking down glycogen to send out into the bloodstream, you'll definitely be able to prolong how long you can do it. And what this figure is showing you right here is how quickly glycogen depletes based on different intensities. And again, what we're talking about for me and you and people that are just regular worker-outers aerobically, you're working out at this intensity here, 60 to 75%. And again, this is that VO2 max. And the only reason I even shared with you about VO2 max is because most of the scientific imagery has VO2 max. They're not really doing too much with heart rate or MET. VO2 max is a clinical measure. But at that moderate intensity right here, what you can see is that it takes about 90 minutes. And the take-home message on this one is that, again, you don't have to really worry about replenishing carbohydrates during your workout unless you're exercising for 90 minutes or more. And I always think this is funny, working out on the treadmill, the people next to me that are slugging like Gatorades and Muscle Milks and all of these, and then they're working out for like 24 minutes. They have absolutely, positively no chance of depleting their glycogen stores. In fact, they're only replacing the calories that they're burning, and it's still a benefit. It's still a muscular and cardiovascular benefit. But as far as weight loss and trying to get rid of fat and use fat and look better for the summer, there's absolutely no utility in standing on the treadmill, drinking Gatorade or sucrose solutions like Gatorade, Powerade, whatever, if you're not working out for more than 90 minutes. Because it's not until about this time that you start depleting, even at low intensities like 60 and 75% VO2 max right here, our moderate intensity that we're working out. It's not until 90 minutes that you start getting at that low level where you start feeling the effects. So no need to replenish unless you are exercising for 90 minutes or more. And again, the type, just because I'm following your notes pages here, beverages. You don't want anything heavy. Typically, if you're having something like a Gatorade or a Powerade, they're going to be about 6 to 10% carbohydrate. They're made of maltodextrins. This might be a little beyond our learning objective, but maltodextrins are kind of like partially digested little chains of glucose. And so they're not simple sugars like glucose because those get in a little too fast. They're actually little chains of glucose. So you have to break them down. They have a little bit of a lower glycemic index. And they're very, chemically made. They're not chemically made. They're, I'm sure, from natural sources, but they're made in a lab where they break down these long starch molecules into short little glucose chains called maltodextrins. And I only say that because if you look at the ingredients list of any of these sports drinks, it will say, maltodextrins. And all that is little chains of glucose so that it takes a little longer for it to get in. Talking about glycogen depletion, I guess really, I had a little bit more detail here, but I won't go into it too much except to say that when you do start to run short on carbohydrate, and again, events lasting more than 90 minutes, the fashion or the sequence in which this happens is that your blood sugar runs low first, and then to get that blood sugar level back up, you start breaking down glycogen in your liver. And then your liver starts to run low. And then after your liver starts to run low and your blood sugar levels are depleting again, then you start breaking down glycogen from the muscle. And the muscle starts shooting it out, but then you start running into issues with hitting the wall, or sometimes it's called bonking. And I'm sure all of us have seen the clips of the marathon runners where their legs are buckling and falling beneath them. That's because they have no fuel left in their muscles and their legs. Again, these are after hours and hours and hours, and this used to be kind of the focus of the lecture. We would talk about glycogen depletion and hepatic output, or how quickly the liver puts out carbohydrates. But for this, I think since most of us are moderate intensity exercisers, we'll keep it simple and say that replenishing carbohydrates during activity is absolutely unnecessary unless you're running a marathon. And if you are, look it up. Pretty interesting stuff. So let's go back, and we talked about carbohydrates. And just a little recap, carbohydrates are important both at the beginning of exercise and throughout. Carbohydrates are important at increasingly as exercise intensity increases. Right at that moderate sweet spot, they're probably about 50 to 60% of the fuel that we're relying on. And then we went over specific carbohydrate intake plans, both days prior, 2 hours prior, 1 hour prior, during, and post. We actually didn't go over post, but you can find it on your, so post, you want to eat carbohydrates right after event. Every 2 hours, have a couple grams per kilogram, and these should be high glycemic: fruits, oranges, juices, etc. That's in your notes. Sorry, I skipped over that. So when it comes to fat, so we just said that carbohydrates during that moderate intensity sweet spot, carbohydrates are about half the amount of fuel that you're burning. Well, what's the other half? It's fat. We're certainly not building protein or using protein for metabolic processes, which is why you don't see protein showing on this slide right now. We don't use protein for catabolic processes. We use protein for anabolic processes, and we will talk about those when we talk about resistance training, and that's when protein is considered a very important nutrient to plan. But for this one, it's fat. Fat and carbohydrates are what we're using during aerobic exercise. Now, I'm going to go back over to this slide right here and show you how we burn carbohydrate. Let's see, I want to clear that, yes. How we burn fat during exercise. So fats aren't nearly as specific, and I'll start with this one and show you why. During any exercise intensity, low, moderate, or high, this is brisk walking, so low intensity. Jogging is a moderate intensity, and running would be a vigorous intensity. And you can see that the proportion of fat across all three of these intensities doesn't change too much. And so it makes sense that there aren't as many prescriptions for the amount of fat to eat because, or the grams, hours before, during, because it doesn't really matter during all the exercise intensities. You're burning about the same amount of fat. The difference is that proportionally to the amount of total calories that you're burning, it's reduced. So in other words, fats burned during jogging, it's about 50%, whereas fats burned during running, what is that, about maybe 25 to 30%. So the proportional change is different. But again, since most of us are working out in this moderate intensity, we can pretty much say that fat is about half the fuel that we're using. And you can also see that illustrated here. Fat is about half of the fuel that we're using at moderate intensity. Now, if you're one of those exercising at a high intensity, then you can see that fat is representing a much larger proportion of, I'm sorry, that's carbohydrates. You can see that fat is representing a much lower proportion of the total calories that are being burned. In fact, all the way as little as 20%. And this is why for fat loss, for weight loss, they recommend exercising at a much lower intensity and a much, maybe even moderate specifically, because you'll still be burning those calories, but you'll be using fat as a fuel source, but you're able to do it for a longer time. So the take-home message here is that as exercise intensity increases, you're actually burning the same amount of fat, absolutely, but relative to total calories being expended, that percentage decreases, okay? And what application does this have? It means that you don't have to tailor or doctor your fat intake hardly at all. Most of the time, the sports nutrition that's related to fat intake is about metabolizing fat and how to take supplements and things that help burn fat more readily because as you guys know, if you remember, when we burn fat aerobically, a lot of times we're doing that by oxidative metabolism, which is something that you only break down and use fat to do. So a lot of the supplementation around fat is around how to burn it better. So I'm going to go back over here. Let's see if I'll show you guys this one. Actually, this is a good time to talk about this little image right here too. This shows that at 1 hour of exercise, you can see that we're burning about 50% carbohydrate. Again, same message there. I'll probably ask you that on the test. At a moderate intensity exercise, we are burning about, 50% of each. As you start exercising out into 2 hours, you can see that we're still only burning about 50% of each. And this is moderate intensity. You can see 65, 70% VO2 max. But as we're exercising for the long haul out here at the 3 and 4 hours, you can see what a larger proportion of fat that we're using. And so this is the whole it's true, it's shown right here in this image, but this is the whole, you got to exercise for a long time to start burning fat. No, you're burning fat all the way through. In fact, it's about half the fuel contributing to your workout, but you're not burning like excessive amounts of fat from storage, plus this plasma means it's coming from your storage areas. It's being brought out of storage into your blood, being brought out of under your chin, behind your arms, your gut. You're not getting rid of most of that until way out here. So if you are at the gym and you're on the treadmill for 30 minutes and you're like, I'm going to push it to 40 so I start burning more fat, man, you got a long way to go before you start really cranking into that fat engine system, at least as a way to get rid of it from storage. So when it comes to the intake, plan for fat. It's not as specific. We're not going to talk about, pre-exercise, post-exercise. It's more just looking at the performance aids around fats, which is why right here you can see, I'm going to clear this page. You can see performance aids are what I have underneath fat, because performance aids are big when it comes to burning fats, but there's no prescription for fat intake. So for some of the fat-based performance aids, there's glycerol or glycerin. And one of the theories behind this is that it binds to water in the muscle. So one, it allows bodybuilders to look a little bigger, and they like that, especially like pre-competition. But when it comes to aerobic exercises, it might help stay more hydrated, because that ability to bind water would obviously help the muscle have more water available to use for metabolic processes during exercise. And if you're exercising in the heat, you might not overheat as readily because you have more water to sweat and to cool yourself more effectively. So glycerin is a fat-based performance aid. You guys might not remember this, but when we talked about, this is probably where I get ahead of myself and people don't like my long-winded lectures, but the glycerol backbone and the 3 fatty acids, that was a triglyceride, remember? Well, this glycerol is removed in a lab and filled in a supplement. It's just the backbone of a fatty acid or a triglyceride, which we learned a little bit about. So that's glycerol. Omega-3 fatty acids, that would be another fat-based performance aid that people take. And the theory behind this is that, we talked about this in the health lecture, it makes the blood a little bit more lubricated, a little less resistant to the flow through the vessels, and it helps with the health of the vessels. So now the vessels are a little bit more compliant, a little more elastic and flexible, and the blood flowing through them is a little bit smoother and softer. The summary of research with omega-3 supplementation for exercise shows that it doesn't really enhance or improve endurance so much, but it may help with some cell structure integrity. So it can't hurt to take it, that's for sure, but I don't think that it necessarily improves endurance performance. Another one is carnitine. And carnitine is a fun one. Let's talk about carnitine for a second, because carnitine is a popular supplement. That this is, again, one of those ones I think we've mentioned in the past, but when you are burning fat aerobically through oxidative phosphorylation, so let me back up for just a second. You have anaerobic metabolism, which I'm just going to write AN, and if you remember, anaerobic metabolism is only carbohydrate. Okay, so I'm going to try to abbreviate CHO. And then you have aerobic metabolism. And this is the kind we're talking about, right? This is the exercise type we're talking about. And aerobic is carbohydrate. Maybe cursive is easier. I need to get one of those. They have these new little writing pads out. I just need to buy one. Aerobic metabolism is carbohydrate and fat. And the fat goes on to be a really energy efficient, regenerates a ton of ATP through oxidative phosphorylation, and I'm just going to put this. So if you keep hearing me say oxidative phosphorylation, or it's got a ton of names, maybe you've heard me call it respiration, and this will all be important in just a second when you learn about carnitine, respiration, and the actual cycle or process that does oxidative phosphorylation or respiration, that doesn't look like an S, is the Krebs cycle. Maybe you remember that term. And another thing that the Krebs cycle is called is the TCA cycle. I'm not going to be re-asking you all of these things on the test. I'm just, hopefully it's sounding familiar to you. So anyway, aerobic metabolism is the breaking down of carbohydrate and fat. When you break down fat, it's called oxidative phosphorylation or respiration, and that process is called the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle. Point is that when fat is burned, either whatever you want to call it, it's burned in the mitochondria in the cell. Here's the mitochondria. This is where the oxidative phosphorylation or respiration takes place. For the fat to be able to get into the cell and into the mitochondria to be broken down for aerobic exercise, it takes an enzyme called carnitine transferase. Now that carnitine transferase, we obviously make that carnitine, we make that enzyme, but the theory is that if you supplement carnitine, if you take it, as part of your diet or as a supplement, that it will allow you to synthesize more of that enzyme, and you will be able to pull more fat into the mitochondria, therefore increasing your ability or capacity to perform oxidative phosphorylation or respiration or the Krebs cycle, whatever you want to call it. So a lot of people take carnitine that do endurance type events because they think that it will allow them to burn fat more efficiently. Now, the interesting thing is research does not really show an increase in performance with a 2 to 4 gram dose anywhere from 1 to 12 weeks. There hasn't really been much found. What they do find is that it does increase your cell concentration of carnitine, so it is getting in. It's not an uptake issue, but it's not necessarily increasing the amount of the enzyme that carnitine is a precursor to. Okay, so carnitine is another, and it's a fat-based one. Why? Because it's dealing with the metabolism and breaking down of fat. Another one that's taken, another fat-based performance aid is caffeine. And caffeine is considered a fat-based performance aid because caffeine causes you to release epinephrine. And the epinephrine actually stimulates your body to release free fatty acids from storage areas into the blood. So that would increase your levels of blood fatty acids or serum fatty acids so that they're more available to do this whole process right here. So if they're in the blood, then they're able to be taken up by the cells, and your cells are able to perform oxidative phosphorylation, respiration, given that oxygen levels are adequate, because this whole process takes oxygen. So caffeine is definitely classified in the fat-based performance aid area because, again, it releases epinephrine. Epinephrine causes the release of that fat from your storage areas into your blood, and then those fats are available for oxidative phosphorylation. Another fat-based performance aid is MCT, or medium chain triglycerides. MCT oil is a type of oil that can be used in a lot of supplements. Muscle milk, I think, is probably the most popular. Muscle milk is a branded drink that uses medium chain triglycerides. And the theory behind these is that remember we talked about long chain fatty acids and how they're absorbed very slowly, and they have to be packaged into chylomicrons, and they're taken to the lymph, and from the lymph they're taken here and there and yet everywhere. Well, medium chain triglycerides, because they're shorter chains, they're actually taken directly to the liver, and they're used right away. So for endurance events, it's helpful to have those available because they don't have to go through as many processing steps. So the general summary of research says that it may actually help spare glycogen. So during that first, 90 minutes of exercise, it possibly does help you save some of your glycogen and use those medium chain triglycerides as a fuel source instead. So that could be a good thing. But overall, the research says, no need to really consume them. I guess they're better than any fat. If you're going to drink fat prior to your workout, maybe MCT are a good choice. The next little nutrient to consider is fluids and electrolytes. So we talked about carbohydrates, the importance of timing and the importance of intensity. We talked about fats and how fats are always in the picture when it comes to aerobic exercise, but most of the fat prescriptions are about performance aids, not gram amount per timing. And then the last important nutritional consideration for fluids and electrolytes would be obviously water for hydration and electrolytes such as sodium, potassium for water balance. And there's all kinds of different recommendations that you can find, but typically before exercise you're supposed to have about 2 cups, and that would be about 2 hours before exercise, and then about 15 minutes prior to exercise have another cup, and again that's 8 ounces. And then during workouts you want to have about a cup every 15 minutes. And this plays a huge role, especially if you're exercising outside or in hot environments where you're sweating to keep your body temperature regulated. You want to make sure that you're well hydrated, because not being well hydrated definitely impairs performance. And if you could imagine why, we talked about how the important role of water and electrolytes in maintaining that balance in the blood and in your cells and keeping all the pressures right. Well, if you're not hydrated, then your blood volume is lower. And then if you think about it, what does your blood do? Your blood is what pumps around the oxygen to your body during working out. But if your blood volume is lower, then your heart has to work twice as hard to get that blood and that oxygen that's in the blood to the working areas and the working muscles that need the fuel. Okay, so you're dehydrated, blood volume low, heart can't get the oxygenated blood down to, say, the calf, and now the calf is burning, and now you're fatigued, and you don't know why. You can't quite put your finger on the fact that it's dehydrated, but that's what it is. So hydrating is really important, and definitely one that's harder to put your finger on. But with electrolytes, typically the ratio in most of the sports drink is about a 3-to-1 ratio of sodium to potassium. So you're going to have, again, I already said this with carbs, but most of those gels, drinks, gums, anything that you're supposed to drink during exercise are going to be about 6 to 10% carbs, and they're going to have electrolytes as well. And the electrolytes are going to be at about 3-to-1 ratio sodium and potassium. So just a couple guidelines there. I'm not sure if I'll be redundant by recapping, but just what we're talking about is aerobic exercise that's done at moderate intensity for long duration, and it can be done for health or for competitive reasons. You're going to want to consider carbohydrates. They're both important for onset and as the duration continues. They're definitely important as exercise intensity increases. They become more and more important. With fat, fat is really important for, it's 50% of the fuel that you're burning, unless you're exercising at really high intensities. But really when it comes to fat, the performance aids are what's most important and ways that we can burn fat more efficiently and effectively. And then when it comes to fluids and electrolytes, super important to stay hydrated for water balance, particularly blood volume, so that the blood can deliver that oxygen. And electrolyte consumption should come in a ratio of about 3-to-1 to sodium and potassium. And then looking at the transformation part of this, speed of absorption, we did talk about this, believe it or not, because we talked about fiber and we talked about glycemic index. We also talked here about energy system use, whether we're using glycolysis aerobically or anaerobically, and respiration. And then cell hydration, we just talked about the importance of that for exercise also. So the effect of eating a particular way will affect these transformation systems in a beneficial way so that you have enhanced endurance. And how that will be expressed is by adaptation. So what will happen to your body? Your heart will be bigger and stronger. Your blood volume will be greater. Your heart will be stronger so that when it pumps more blood out, so it has to pump fewer times per minute. Your cardiovascular capacity will be enhanced. Another adaptation that I love to talk about, because I just drew a cell with a mitochondria and said that mitochondria is where respiration happens, and it's why people take carnitine. But what's funny is well-trained people that exercise a lot, guess what they have? Way more mitochondria. They have more than one mitochondria in their cell, so they can burn even more fat. So that's another adaptation. It's one of many, but since we just talked about it. And then you'll also have anthropometric changes. What are the changes that are going to happen? You're going to be accessing those free fatty acids from the back of your, arms, your chin, your abdomen. You'll have a better body fat. Your percent body fat will be much better. And so you'll see those changes in anthropometrics too. And your cardiovascular capacity, again, your heart rate will be lower, your max heart rate will be higher, your VO2 will be higher and better, your ability to consume oxygen, your VO2 max. So all those changes and wonderful things will happen as you gain enhanced endurance through aerobic type activities. So hopefully that answers some of your questions about how to eat and what to eat and why you eat a particular way for aerobic exercise. Now let's talk a little bit about, we're not going to cover this, but you can use this little table. It's kind of hard to see, but if you Google it, you can probably find a more clear version. It's from Gatorade. It's just a nice little table for how to calculate sweat loss. And really my whole point about the fluid lecture part was going to be about how to replace the exact amount that you sweat out, because you don't want to drink too much. You can be hyperhydrated easily and not feel well from too much. So I was going to teach you how to calculate sweat rate, and that's how much water you should replace. But I think if you go with the general guidelines of, a cup every X minutes, you're probably going to be fine. But this is what they do for athletes who are it's super important, like Olympic athletes definitely take the time to do this. They're metabolic people. So let's talk about eating for resistance exercise. And so resistance exercise, we're talking about anaerobic types of exercises, and the basic principles of these are just the opposite. They're very, very vigorous, very, very high intensity, all the way to maximum, and they're done for a very short duration. So now we're talking about activities that are done for less than 2 minutes. And so obviously the dietary strategy for these are going to be very different. And believe it or not, there are definitely recommendations for health. So in other words, back to the CDC saying that you can live a lot longer if you do these couple things. So there are resistance recommendations, and those would be to exercise with power exercises like weightlifting or calisthenics, like yoga, to use those fast twitch muscle fibers. Do it at a high intensity, do it for under a minute, and do it 2 to 3 days per week. So definitely you see less days per week in there. But also for sport. For sport, I would say, you know, aerobic capacity and endurance is super important, but these guys are getting that in their, you know, daily practices. I think resistance training programs are what you'll see most common when you work with a strength and conditioning expert. Like if you're a pro athlete, I think that the most important part of your exercise program is probably the resistance program, because anything that has a high intensity, even, you know, short or long duration, so high intensity being like shot put, bodybuilding, football, gymnastics, track and field, swimming, baseball, all of those are really, really high intensity sports that require a ton of power. They're probably more focused on a resistance program. Now, obviously soccer players have both. They need both endurance and power, so they're working on both. So depending on the type of sport it is, but I think for most sports, resistance programs are more emphasized by their strength and conditioning people. So what are the primary nutritional considerations for resistance exercise? There's a few things. The first one is obviously increased calories. So you want to make sure that you bump up your calorie intake a little bit, not a lot, but you can express this as grams per kilogram. So the recommendation is about 5 grams per kilogram per day. And if you wanted to put that in pounds expressions, it's about 8 calories per pound. And what this equates to is a range from about 300 to 500 calories per day. So you want to make sure that you're getting those extra calories. And the reason why is because you do need to get a little bit of extra protein, not a lot, but a little extra protein and a little extra carbohydrate if you want to have tissue synthesis happen. And we all know that to grow muscles, we want that tissue to grow. So we need those extra calories, protein, and carbohydrate for that extra tissue to grow. So make sure you're getting some extra calories. When it comes to carbohydrates, most people think that carbohydrates are not important for resistance type activities, but they are super important for resistance activities. And let me fast forward back to this slide for why. So we're going to talk a little bit about this system in just a couple minutes, but you can see that for 40 seconds, you're using carbohydrates. Remember, glycolytic was a carbohydrate engine. So you're using carbohydrates for 40 seconds. Think about when you do a set, any kind of resistance set. I mean, it's not lasting much more than a minute, maybe 2 minutes if you're working on muscular endurance. It's about a minute. So you're definitely heavily relying on carbohydrate engines. Now, they're anaerobic ones. It's glycolytic, anaerobic carbohydrate engine systems for that first minute of exercise. So you have to have enough carbohydrate stored in the muscle. And also, that's another important note, it's got to be stored in the muscle. It can't be trying to get transported out of the liver, put into the blood, taken to the target muscle tissue. It's got to be right there in the muscle. So even for resistance training programs, it's super important to make sure that the carbohydrate intake is adequate so that you have an adequate amount of glycogen right there in the muscle that's ready to be used. And so some of the recommendations for carbohydrates, again, you'll see these vary, but you want to make sure that you're sparing that protein in the muscle, only using glycogen. And the recommendation is about 30 grams 1 to 2 hours before a weight training exercise. Now, when it comes to protein, so protein's obviously going to be like our chunkiest talk here. And then we'll talk a little bit about some other ergogenic aids that people take for resistance programs. But protein and amino acids are definitely the biggest hot note on resistance training. And let's talk generally first about how much protein in general. So whole protein, the amount that you should have is, believe it or not, the same as the AMDR, just like with carbs. It's about 12 to 15% of calories. Now, what you'll notice is, like I said at the beginning, you do need a little bit more protein and calories and et cetera. So you're probably like, well, I thought we needed more protein. Well, think about it. If you get 300 to 500 extra calories per day, let's call it 500. You got 500 calories extra per day, and 15% of that was protein. That's more protein per day. So just by virtue of getting that increase in calories, as long as you keep the proportion of calories the same between fat, carbs, and protein, you will be getting the amount of extra protein that you need. Now, there's tons of questions I get. Probably the most popular category of questions that I get about type of protein and quality of protein, and what about processed proteins and muscle powders and all those kind of things. And I'll try to keep it a general little overview here. You can either get whole protein, like a chicken breast or like an egg or like a steak, or you can get broken down or partially hydrolyzed proteins like dipeptides, tripeptides, or all the way down to their single little molecular structure, amino acids. It doesn't really matter your choice of any of these. I think if you have tons of money, any of them are fine. If you're on a budget, you probably just want to consume whole proteins. Your body will break them down. Your body will convert them to the needed amino acids. But if you don't have a budget and you like to buy protein and sport supplements, that's fine. Anytime you buy dipeptides, tripeptides, whole proteins like casein or whey or chicken, it's all the same stuff, and your body does all the same stuff with it. So when it comes to the question, does kind matter? The only thing you want to be sure of is that the protein source is complete. So you don't want all your protein coming from beans and grains and legumes. You want to make sure, and even if you are a vegetarian, that's fine. Just make sure you're following those complementation principles that we talked about. You got to make sure that your protein amino acids are complementing each other so that there's none limiting. And again, we'll kind of revisit that concept. When you go to build tissue or build a muscle, it calls for all the amino acids. Now you don't want any missing, or else you won't have them all to build the muscle that you need. So you want to make sure when it comes to type, it doesn't really matter as long as all the amino acids are there in the right concentration, and animal sources are a sure way to do that. You'll get them all if you have all animal sources, casein, whey, and soy to some extent, but I won't get into it. I also had a really good question about what if you heat protein powder? So someone was trying to cook with them. It doesn't matter. Most of the proteins that we eat are heated anyway. If you think about it, we cook our chicken, we cook most of our stuff except raw sushi. So it doesn't matter if they're heated or processed. It will change the structure. It'll change from this tertiary structure to a different, more simple chemical structure. But the amino acids, once they're in our bodies, it doesn't affect it at all to be heated or processed or anything like that. Also, when it comes to proteins and amino acids, it's not like carbohydrates either, in that, 2 hours prior, 1 hour prior. And I've got a little bit of that here for you because I did find some guidelines and recommendations. But guys, protein synthesis or muscle tissue synthesis happens for up to 2 days after a resistance training workout. So if you lift weights at the gym, 48 hours later, you still have increased tissue synthesis going on because of that program. So really to say like, oh, 1 hour, 45 minutes, 4 hours, it's kind of, it's kind of silly. But the general recommendations say that anywhere from about 1.2 to 1.8 grams per kilogram per day. Now let's think back. Do you guys remember when we talked about the RDA? What did we say it was? 0.8 grams per kilogram. 0.8 grams per kilogram. So let me say that again out loud. The range for athletes would be about 1.2 to 1.8. That's going to be the difference in those 500 calories. And any more than that has absolutely no positive effect on the amount of tissue or muscle that we're able to synthesize. I'm going to fast forward to this. Show you, this is one of my favorite images from a study. I love this study. It shows both a low protein diet and a high protein diet for both a sedentary, a bodybuilding person, and an endurance athlete. And what it shows is that this is the protein level, I'm sorry, actually right here, 1.1, 1.0, and 1.7. Again, the plain RDA is 0.8, so it's just a little bit higher. And what you can see is a positive nitrogen balance. As long as you're in a positive nitrogen balance, meaning the amount you pee, you're peeing a little bit of excess nitrogen, meaning that your body has plenty to go and synthesize those tissue proteins. Okay, so what it shows here is that when it went all the way up to 2.7 grams per kilogram per body weight, which is definitely what bodybuilders do. They're like, I had 9 eggs and 4 chicken breasts and 2 steaks. It doesn't matter. The nitrogen balance is super, super high. That means they're just peeing out that nitrogen. They're just pissing out that extra nitrogen. They're not building any extra muscle. So even in bodybuilders that consumed 1 gram per kilogram of body weight were in a positive nitrogen balance. This is definitely a landmark study that's used a lot to really emphasize how you don't need all of that protein. So general recommendations, 1.2 to 1.8. Everybody was in a nitrogen balance at approximately 1.4 in this study, so 1.4 grams per kilograms per day. So what does that mean for you? If you're a 70 kilogram guy, and I'm going to pop out here to my calculator real quick. If you are a 70 kilogram guy times 1.4, 50 grams of protein per day. Doesn't seem like a lot. You'll probably want more. Go ahead. It's not going to kill you, but you're definitely peeing it out. So what about before weight training? Before weight training, the typical little guideline for bodybuilding, which is why I don't like this, is 1 to 3 hours before, 50 to 60 grams. I think that's too much, but it's what I found out of a bodybuilding book and what most of you are probably used to reading. And then just after exercising, they say maybe immediately better than 2 hours, because as little as 6 grams of essential amino acids definitely increase muscle protein synthesis. So again, to kind of recap there, I think the daily is the most important part. 1.2 to 1.8, average is 1.4. That's not a whole lot. Before weight training, anywhere from 1 to 3 hours before. Some people do say they pop it out to about 1 hour before. That way those proteins are available and in the body and in the blood and cells by the time you're doing your workout. So what amino acid supplements are on the market? When it comes to amino acids, there's literally, you guys, 50 popular compounds and thousands of products, and I'm certainly not going to talk about all of those, but just to give you some of the theories behind why some are taken. So one popular one, and definitely increasing in popularity, is beta-alanine. We have a faculty member that does a lot of research with this. Beta-alanine, or alanine, is actually a non-essential amino acid, but it increases this compound called carnosine, which is technically being studied as a neurotransmitter, but carnosine is a buffer for the muscle. And so you're able to take it and it buffers that buildup of lactic acid during that glycolytic metabolic part. So you've got that 40 seconds where you're burning carbs anaerobically, that lactic acid builds up. And so carnosine is a buffer. So people think that if they take alanine, they'll make more carnosine and they'll be able to buffer that lactic acid in their muscle and work out at a higher intensity. Other amino acids that are taken are arginine. I've lumped these together because they all have the same type of effect. Arginine, lysine, and ornithine. These are all amino acids that are thought to enhance or increase the production of growth hormone. And growth hormone is obviously necessary for muscle tissue synthesis. People also, one of the most popular supplements are branched chain amino acids. And branched chain amino acids are all essential, and valine, leucine, and isoleucine. People love to take these in doses of about 10 grams, both pre and post-workout. And the theory behind these is that they're able to be used directly by the muscle, so they're able to not only be used in like gluconeogenic processes, but also for muscle building. And leucine specifically of the branched chain amino acids is popular because leucine is actually an amino acid that helps regulate metabolism. And how it does that is certainly complicated, but leucine regulates the mTOR pathway, which upregulates genes that regulate metabolism. So I would never expect you to know all this. I'll recap at the end, the take-homes. People take glycine and arginine, and the reason why is because glycine and arginine are 2 amino acids that are the precursors to creatine. And if you guys remember back here, where is it? The PCR system right here, we haven't really even talked about this yet. So the first 30 seconds of exercise, let me clear this page, we're taking this phosphocreatine, and just like ATP, we talked about how ATP, that phosphate's broken off and we got to remake that. Well, creatine phosphate, same thing. Phosphates popped off and we use that little energy that comes from that bond for our muscles to contract. Well, that's what's going to happen the first 30 seconds of exercise, is that we're using a ton of phosphocreatine, which is why people supplement it. They try to get more of it in the muscle so they're able to work out at a higher intensity without getting fatigued as fast. So 2 big principles for bodybuilding is to make sure you've got glycogen stored up and make sure that you have plenty of phosphocreatine in the muscle. But people also take glycine and arginine because it's a precursor to creatine, which might allow you to have more phosphorylated creatine in the muscle. You know, guys, I've got some other mineral compounds on here, boron, chromium, vitamins, and I think that is enough. I think I've talked enough about the different principles. Again, I said I'll do a recap so that you know kind of what I'm hoping that you got from this. So we talked about aerobic exercise. I would want you to know what nutrients were important to consider. We talked about carbohydrates and the reasons why carbohydrates were important for aerobic. We also talked a little bit about a couple of the fat performance aids that are taken and the importance of fluids and electrolytes, and that you would know the basic recommendations for those. For resistance exercise, we also talked about what's important to consider for that type of program. We talked about calories, carbs, proteins, and other ergogenic aids. Calories, know the amount to increase your caloric intake. know the importance of carbohydrates and why carbs are so important for resistance programs. And again, it's that initial minute of those glycolytic or anaerobic systems. We talked about protein, know the amount that is perfect for nitrogen balance or what's shown in research to be plenty, even for bodybuilders, and know some of those different popular amino acids that people take. Other ergogenic aids, the only one we really talked about was creatine. In this category, I didn't talk with you about any of the vitamin or mineral aids that are taken because I feel like the lecture is getting a little too long. And we did talk about different energy systems. The ones that are used are PCR and glycolytic, and we did talk a little bit about this. And the outcome of all of that is larger and more powerful muscles, yay. And I don't have feedback on here like I did on the last slide, but the feedback would be a larger bicep circumference or more power, or your 1RM is much stronger. So that's going to be the outcome of doctoring those nutrients, performing that exercise regimen. And a really important take-home note on resistance exercise is no matter how much protein you consume, you will not synthesize any muscle tissue unless you injure the muscle. So you have to do the weight lifting, you have to rip and shred and tear those little tiny little filaments of the muscle to create any kind of growth. So don't think just because you increase protein intake, you're going to increase your muscle size. In fact, you'll just increase your fat around your stomach if you eat too much protein and don't do resistance training. You have to do both to have muscle hypertrophy and hyperplasia. So anyways, guys, that's it. Nutrition for Fitness covers those two major umbrella topics, and thank you for listening. Have a good one.